Welcome to Defund the BBC. My name is Calvin Robinson, and joining me this week is Brendan O'Neill. Brendan is a journalist, a columnist, best known as the editor of Spiked. He's been a columnist at The Australian, The Big Issue, The Spectator, The Daily Telegraph, to name only but a few. Once a Trotskyist, O'Neill is formerly a member of the Revolutionary Communist Party and wrote for the party's journal, Living Marxism. Would it be fair to say that, Brendan, you're now a libertarian Marxist?
Yeah, possibly. I've kind of gone off the word libertarian a little bit. I think libertarians have been quite disappointing over the past year, over the past few years, in fact, but over the past year in particular. I think libertarians are kind of losing touch with liberty. So I'm going off the word libertarian. The word Marxist doesn't really mean anything anymore, except bad things. Like the kind of people who call themselves Marxists are the most dreadful people in the world right now. So I used to call myself a libertarian Marxist. In my head, I understand what it means, but it's become a difficult term.
Yeah. I think we should just probably move away from labels, to be honest with you.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree.
Post-label society. So in a piece for The Telegraph, Nigel Farage slams Boris Johnson for totally bottling it when it comes to the BBC, and that many of those who voted for him are deeply disappointed that he hasn't sought to bring about any serious reform or seek to scrap the licence fee. I think about 91% of Telegraph readers, typical blue-blooded Tory voters, want the licence fee scrapped. So why do you think Boris Johnson is not standing up for them?
Well, I think Boris is a bit of a bottler on lots of different issues. So it wouldn't surprise me if he was a bottler on the BBC question as well. Boris, I'm finding it hard to work Boris out. I mean, I sympathise with him on numerous issues. I think he's pretty good. On certain questions. He's a colourful person. He's an interesting person. He's certainly the most interesting Prime Minister we've had for a long time. But he is a bit spineless sometimes. He kind of ducks. If a difficult conflict is on the horizon, he will run away from it. I think that's his instinct. And we saw that over the past year of culture wars where, with the Black Lives Matter explosion, he kind of left the stage. I mean, he said one or two things about statues and one or two things about Winston Churchill, but he didn't make a good case for British history or British traditions or why it's problematic to wipe aside certain images and certain icons. He kind of absented himself from that conflict. And I think probably something similar is happening in relation to the BBC. He's not quite sure what to do. He doesn't want a conflict. He doesn't want to face down this vast institution, which is what the BBC is. But the BBC does need reform. That's very clear. That's obviously something you work on tirelessly. The BBC does need reform. Some politician needs to be brave enough to put his head above the parapet and say, listen, the public broadcaster no longer represents the public. It no longer speaks to the public. In fact, it sneers at the public very often. And I think the politician who says that and explains why that means we need change could actually be pretty successful.
I agree, and it's a shame that we don't seem to have many brave politicians at the moment, because the British public, about 70% of the British public, say they're more likely to vote for a party that pledges to scrap the licence fee. Why do you think none of the parties can stand up and say, we will do this if this was what the people want?
That's a really good question. I think it's probably a couple of things. Firstly, they probably don't want to go to war with the BBC. The BBC is very powerful. It's an incredibly influential organization. It has a lot of money. It has a lot of, it covers a lot of the news. It impacts on various different areas of our lives. So the BBC is very influential, and many politicians probably don't want to have a standoff with it. Also, I think there's the culture war question. And unfortunately, for those of us who are interested in genuine change that would benefit the people of this country, being against the BBC or even just being critical of the BBC has come to be seen as a bit of a cranky right-wing thing. That's largely courtesy of the noisiest side in the culture war, which is the pseudo-leftish side, the kind of woke side. They're the ones who have fairly successfully painted critics of the BBC as just the kind of a small bunch of extremists who are never happy with anything. And I think challenging that perception, that misperception of critics of the BBC is very important. And I think that probably is one of the reasons why politicians are not always so keen to have this open, frank discussion that we need. But it seems to me to be more pressing than ever. You know, the BBC has become increasingly detached from the people it is supposed to speak to, from the people it is supposed to embody. You can see that in everything from its news coverage, from its promotion of crazy woke ideology about the problem with white women, or how you should speak about race and the difficulties of white privilege. I mean, all these ideas which are genuinely minority ideas held by the eccentric chattering classes. The BBC has bought into all of that. And I do think there needs to be a confrontation with the BBC, and someone needs to ask it, listen, what are you for in the 21st century?
Absolutely. So let's talk about the woke chattering classes for a moment, because despite being given the BBC's prime time slot, Greta Thunberg's first big TV show was proven to be a massive ratings flop. You know, proof that actually the license fee payer doesn't want to be subjected to watching climate alarmists ramming theories down their throats. They've even started inviting 5-year-olds to submit raps about climate change in some kind of internal BBC competition. Is this further evidence of a system in which we pay and they preach?
Absolutely. The BBC, I feel preached at by the BBC all the time these days. The problem is that when you switch over to another channel, you often feel preached at by them as well. I mean, if you look at something like Netflix, I mean, Netflix is the cathedral of contemporary woke nonsense with its dramas that it puts out. So there's a lot of it going on. But yes, the BBC is at the cutting edge of that preaching culture that we currently live under. And climate change is a very good example of how that works, because I think the beauty of the climate change issue for those people is that it allows them to play almost a priestly role in society. So climate change alarmism, to my mind, has become almost like a fundamentalist religion. I'm not going to say it's like a religion. I've got a great deal of respect for people who are religious, which includes my family. So religion is absolutely fine, but climate change alarmism has become kind of end of days fundamentalist religious cult. I mean, the way it talks about the world coming to an end, the way it talks about mankind as this singularly sinful entity that is constantly pumping out pollution and dirt and destroying his environment, the way it talks about us needing to make sacrifices, to do penance for our eco crimes, you know, by planting trees or some other form of self-flagellation. So it's taken on all these fundamentalist ideas, and it really does push the notion that mankind's hubris is bringing the world to an end. And I think the role played by someone like Greta Thunberg is almost like a messianic role. You know, she's the infant Messiah who's come to reveal to us the sinful ways that we have been following for the past few decades. And the BBC loves all of that. It loves the Greta Thunberg phenomenon. It loves the fact that David Attenborough, tragically, in my view, has gone from making superb natural programming to making essentially eco-propaganda, which constantly pushes the idea that humankind is virtually a plague on the planet. So the way in which, on that issue in particular, the way in which the BBC has gone in recent decades from making some of the greatest TV shows ever about the natural world to now pumping out ceaseless propaganda about how mankind is despoiling the natural world and bringing about the end of the planet as we know it, that really demonstrates the role that climate change alarmism plays for the new elites. It's the key platform in many ways from which they can dictate to the plebs.
Yeah, it's quite sad actually, and especially, you know, if we consider this stance that they take on everything. So obviously we had the extremely sad passing of His Royal Highness Prince Philip. Although the bulk of the BBC's coverage was quite respectful, there were some elements of it that were still quite, let's say, troubling. So for example, the BBC thought it would be a good idea to publicize a complaints form, especially for this issue, inviting people to essentially complain about there being too much coverage of Prince Philip's passing, as well as on the day of the funeral, some very distasteful commentary by BBC commentators who proceeded to talk about the royal family's gossip. Completely tasteless, lack of any real sense of professionalism. I mean, Brendan, we shouldn't really have a bunch of individuals who can't seem to get the basics right, essentially cramming their woke agenda down our throats every time we turn on the BBC, should we?
Absolutely not. And I think the death and funeral of the Duke of Edinburgh were good examples of what you're talking about. Now, as it happens, I'm a Republican, so I differ from a lot of my friends, some of my colleagues who tend to be, some of whom are monarchists. But I recognize that we live in a constitutional monarchy, and in a constitutional monarchy, the public broadcaster ought to be able to be respectful of that, and ought to be able to tune in to what a constitutional monarchy needs when a senior member of the family passes away. And I think what happened with the death of Prince Philip is that it really captured how confused the BBC is. So initially they went into overkill to a certain extent. They instantly cancelled everything without any explanation or discussion for why that might happen. Then they tried to compensate for that by saying, well, if you want to complain, fill in this form, that's absolutely fine, we don't mind. And of course, people love complaining. I've never understood people who complain about TV shows. I've seen so many rubbish or offensive or stupid TV shows over the years, and I've never once felt the urge to complain about them. But of course, people do. We live in a complaining culture, especially amongst the woke set. So that open door to complain about the coverage of Prince Philip's death, people ran through it and they complained in large numbers, and the BBC should have predicted that that would happen. And then that became the story. The story became how many people were complaining, how many people were irritated. And so the BBC messed up, essentially. And if you can't get something like that right, then there really is a huge question mark hanging over your head. And, you know, the Queen is now 95 years old. She's not going to last forever. And the question of how, and her death is going to be the most significant in the UK for a very long time. And I'm not sure the BBC will even be able to get something like that right. So this speaks to, I think, how troubled and confused the public broadcaster is right now.
I absolutely agree. And now finally, the BBC's comedy department has also been under fire for its lazy jokes about straight white men. This comes from a joke made by TV presenter and comedian Catherine Ryan, who presents one of those jewelry competition shows. But wouldn't you say, Brendan, it's funny that, you know, we don't set out to offend, and comedy is subjective, or only excuses that are used by the BBC when talking about straight white men being the brunt of the joke?
BBC comedy, I don't get it. That's what I would say about it. It's just, I mean, the biggest crime is how unfunny it is. I mean, you watch these panel shows and these sketch shows that they do, especially the political ones, and it's just really unfunny. And I think what's really striking is that lots of these comedians, you know, people like Nish Kumar, for example, and Stuart Lee, who's a bit of a darling of the BBC, and other people like that, they see themselves as cutting edge and really daring and really countercultural. But of course, they're just going along with the woke mob. They're all anti-Brexit, of course. You have to be, or else you will be expelled from polite society. They all think people who vote Tory are stupid idiots. They all think we're a bunch of racists. You know, the country is full of racist scumbags. They have all the predictable orthodox views that you must have if you want to be a part of the chattering classes. So they are completely and utterly conformist. They're completely and utterly mainstream in the sense of what's coming from that section of society. So the BBC loves all of that, because what it means is that even their comedy section can become another way of lecturing the public. You know, when I look at people like, I think Stuart Lee is a good example. Stuart Lee is the kind of edgiest comedian that the BBC claims to have, but I just see him as almost like a Bernard Manning of the woke set, because, you know, these comedians do come out with some pretty contemptible stuff about ordinary people, the stupidity of Brexit voters, you know, what a bunch of idiots up in the north and in parts of Wales, you know, who are in Essex, of course, who are these stupid working class people who've destroyed the country by opposing the European Union. I mean, just a litany of insults is all that we tend to get from BBC comedians. And it really, and the butt of their jokes, of course, is always the straight white male, very often the working class straight white male, because they see them as being inferior. And people are sick and tired of it. What people don't want safe, nice comedy that is charitable about everybody. That's not what comedy is for, but they certainly want comedy that's funny. They'd like a bit of comedy that goes against the grain. And I think they're sick of comedy being used as yet another vehicle to lecture the public.
Yeah, just imagine being on the side of the establishment and the mainstream media and thinking you're edgy. It's a joke, isn't it? Brendan O'Neill, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for your refreshing views, and keep fighting the good fight.
Thanks, Calvin.